So we're back, and I took a little bit of a break to do some other things, but want to get back into, getting these videos out, and the movie I'm reviewing today is The Killer's Game. Now, it's a tad late, because I saw this opening weekend, but I just had so many videos I had to get out that I could not put off, like this sucker, and then a couple of other videos you could have seen recently, and I was like, is it too late to review this movie? But it just became available on streaming, so it's like, if there's a second time I could review this, now is the time. And so the question is, how is The Killer's Game? I had so much fun with this movie. Let's get into it.
You think this kid is anything? I'm calling in every hit on Europe, you hear me?
Yeah, well, you tell them to pack light. Because they won't fucking be staying long.
What is going on, Joe?
Daisy, I'm a hitman.
What? You kill people?
That's what an assassin is, yeah.
Okay, so like I said before, I did see this movie on opening weekend, but the weird thing is, like, Lionsgate, the distribution studio behind this, they really didn't put any effort into promoting this movie. The theater I go to is a massive theater. Typically when there is a new movie available, like 4 of the theaters are all dedicated to said movie. That's how big this theater is. When I went to get the tickets, it was only showing in 1 theater with only 2 showtimes during the day. This was opening weekend. So not only did this not get a huge wide release with the typical amount of theaters that normally go to a movie, but the marketing behind this was kind of terrible. There was barely any, and what little there was kind of spoiled the first half of this movie. I'll get into that later. So I wasn't surprised when I found out this was a huge financial disappointment at the box office. But went to see it, and like the general synopsis of this movie, I don't want to spoil too much like the trailers do. Seriously, if you see a trailer on YouTube or anywhere, don't watch it, just because it spoils the first 50% of this movie, and kind of you know what's going to happen, and it's not that interesting. If you go into this fresh, you'll love the first half of this film. So the general synopsis of this film is, it follows this like world-class, top of his game hitman played by Dave Bautista, and he kind of strikes up this relationship with this ballerina by the name of Maisie, and over the course of this relationship, he kind of decides, you know what? I'm thinking I'm gonna kind of get out of the game. The title, The Killer's Game, And over a series of events I don't want to spoil to you, he gets a contract put out on his head, and now multiple assassins are trying to take out this world-class master assassin. And yeah, I really enjoyed this movie. For starters, Dave Bautista did a pretty solid job playing this somewhat aging hitman that is kind of getting tired of it all and kind of is asking, is there more to life than this? And then he meets Maisie, and kind of their relationship I enjoyed. I thought it was a pretty decent romantic affair for seeing something roll out on screen. There's other movies that involve hitmen or spies, and the relationship, it just kind of feels forced and not natural. And this one, it kind of felt realistic, and as realistic as a relationship with a world-class assassin could feel. And like the cast to this is fantastic. I mean, you got Dave Bautista, you got Sophia Boutella, you got Ben Kingsley, who does a good job being Ben Kingsley. Grant, his character's like a lot of other characters. He doesn't go outlandishly insane like some of his other movies. Just watch Courier, Collide. Like, if you want to see Ben Kingsley get out of his comfort zone and do something insanely wacky, go watch Collide. And, you have a lot of other characters, like, I can never pronounce her name, but the woman who played Mantis in Guardians of the Galaxy, she's back in this. Scott Adkins, and I had to write down his name because his last name always throws me. Daniel Bernhardt. is in this, and he may not seem familiar to you, but if you've watched any action movies over the past 30 years, you'll recognize this guy along with Scott Adkins and a few other people. And Terry Crews is also in this. It's an awesome cast, and it just helps add to the fun that this movie is. And then, while watching this movie, I was a little bit surprised by the action sequences and the fights and the stunt work. And I'm like, okay, who directed this? And it was a guy by the name of J.J. Perry, if I'm not mistaken his name. I'm like, who's that? And I pulled up like his information after the movie. I'm just like, oh, okay. And this guy basically has like a long filmography of doing stunt work, stunt coordination, filming, directing, writing, producing. Like, this guy is like done it all. So when the fight scenes happen in this movie and they were kind of spectacular, I was thinking, did one of the two guys who did John Wick do this movie? And it's like, no, but someone like them did, and I really appreciated that. It's always fun seeing an action movie where like the director is someone who knows how to properly film and craft an action sequence. There are some movies out there that are fun movies, but the fight scenes and the action scenes, they just don't really mesh right because the director doesn't have a history in stunt work and working with stuntmen and whatnot. Also, it does help that you have Daniel Bernhardt and Scott Adkins as secondary characters in this movie, and it's like those guys always do amazing fight stunt choreography work in their films when they're allowed to. They both have a couple of movies where they just weren't really allowed to do a lot, and they weren't working with a competent director, and it's like, I expected more out of you two, but not with this one. They obviously had a good director to work with, and that led to some really fantastic action sequences. And another thing, I don't always call it out, but when I do see it, it's awesome. And this movie had some really spectacular camera work, especially with this one montage they did partway through the movie of showing a passing of time and jumping from scene to scene. It was so tight and fantastically done. It was like some of the best camera work I've seen of a movie this year. And it was just like, while I was in the theater watching, I was like, wow, that's really good. Wow, this is a really fantastic like scene to scene transition. Like, they just did some really solid work with some of the camera work in this film. And then going back to kind of the action sequences, one thing I always appreciate is when the stunt coordinator or the fight choreographer, they don't have all the fighters fighting like they all had the same teacher. That's one of my small gripes with movies like The Matrix. It kind of feels like every single person in that movie learned how to fight from the same teacher. And in this movie, you can kind of tell that people had different styles, different methods of hand-to-hand combat. I know it's not a huge aspect when it comes to a movie in total, but I always appreciate it when you have two characters in a movie fighting very differently. Case in point, there's this one fight scene with Dave Bautista and this Asian guy, and this Asian guy is doing all these like flips and spins, and Dave Bautista is not doing any flips or spins. He's just like kind of moving like a boxer or a wrestler, obviously, and it felt like two completely different fighting styles going head to head. And when you have little details like that with good camera work, a good director, and good stunt choreographer and fight choreographer, you get some really fantastic fight scenes. And this movie has all of that. And so it led to me having a really fun time with this film. One of the highlights, though, are the secondary characters. Granted, Dave Bautista, Terry Crews, Sofia Boutella, these are the main characters. But most of the secondary cast are fantastic, with the alternate hitmen and some of the supporting characters. Like, case in point, Ben Kingsley is Dave Bautista's boss in this film, and he has a wife. And you wouldn't expect much out of the main character's boss's wife's character. And she doesn't get a lot of screen time, but what little screen time she does get, she absolutely steals every scene she's in. It's just fantastic. And then some of the assassins, they don't get a lot of screen time, but what little they do, they just steal the show, and they are just absolutely fantastic. Are they comically over the top? Absolutely. I mean, let's be honest. If you actually met a group of real assassins that operate today, they would all look like, you know, Michael Fassbender in The Killer. They would be plain, ordinary looking intentionally so that they don't stand out in a crowd. And like these guys, they stand out so much, it's like every cop would be pulling these guys over left and right because they just are so flamboyant looking. But for a movie like this, it doesn't really matter because you know it's a comic book vibed movie. Granted, it's not based on a comic book, but it has a very comic book feel sometimes, especially with the assassins. But they really stand out, and some of them are really awesome. And probably my favorite characters in this movie are the two hitmen from Scotland. Is it Scotland or Ireland? I think it's Scotland. And they were so likable. I was really hoping they didn't die in this movie, but let's be honest. Dave Bautista has plot armor because he's the main character. It's like, yeah, I gotta root for the main character, but just I'm really hoping that these two make it because Scott Adkins and this other guy were just so hilarious every moment they were on screen. I just absolutely loved them. And then another thing I liked about this movie, and I always like pointing it out, everyone suffers from what a friend of mine calls sequelitis. Basically, you're making a story and you want to make a sequel. And as you're writing a story, you're thinking of sequels. And every movie loves teasing a sequel. I'm guilty of that with some of the stories I've written. But I have to acknowledge, whenever I see a movie have a definitive end, where it's like no tease for a sequel, no setup for future films, it's kind of refreshing because you don't see it that often. But when they do it, when they actually have a movie that doesn't tease a sequel, doesn't set up for future films, it's kind of refreshing, and I like pointing it out when it happens. And The Killer's Game, when the movie's over, it's like, yeah, the story is done. No tease of a sequel, no plans for a future, which works in their case because this movie this movie was a box office bomb, unfortunately. Okay, so in terms of any issues I had coming out of the movie the first time, I didn't really have any problems with this film. And I was thinking, is this a perfect film in my mind? And then I saw it a second time when it came out streaming this last weekend. And it's like, okay, trying to nitpick here. Grenades are a little bit bullshit in this movie. They don't really kill. They just kind of push people. And if you know anything about grenades, you're lucky to survive one. And literally you have grenades go off right next to a person. You're staying here, and the grenade goes off here, and they get pushed away, and they shake their head, they get up. It's like, it's a little unrealistic, guys. You're doing really good with the stunt choreography. You should have had grenades a little bit more realistic. Claymores, on the other hand, are quite realistic in this movie. And then another thing, they didn't do it too bad, but there is one action sequence. Okay, let's be fair. There's a couple of action sequences where people attack the main character one at a time. Now, does the fighting look great? Absolutely. But it's a little unrealistic when people attack a guy one at a time in a movie. Again, this is a nitpick, but I'm trying to find any negative I can with this movie. And then, I don't necessarily see a problem, but you might. The overly colorful, insanely flamboyant assassins. After getting a movie like The Killer, where you have a very grounded, realistic take on an assassin, someone who blends in with the crowd, doesn't make any noise, someone who prides themselves on being a undescriptive face in the crowd. It's like, yeah, that's probably how assassins are. In this, they are insanely flamboyant, and it's great for a movie like this, but if you're talking about, is this realistic though? Not really. So again, I don't hold that against the movie, but you might. And it's unfortunate that this movie bombed because it didn't have an insanely high budget. It only had a budget of like $30 million. It's easy for a movie to make that back in box office returns, even on its opening weekend. but it only made $5 million at the box office. Maybe it'll do better now that it's on streaming, and I highly recommend you guys check it out on streaming. But Lionsgate has been making some really weird decisions this year. They put a lot of money into advertising Borderlands and The Crow, and both those were huge flops, and they put almost nothing into promoting this movie. And yes, it got some negative reviews, a lot of negative reviews actually, but honestly, I think if they had promoted this better, this would have gotten a better fanfare from people, and I think people would have really enjoyed this if they gave this movie a chance. So I think you guys really should go out and rent this right now on streaming, because it is just a fun action movie. Everyone does a solid job. I enjoyed it. If you just need a good popcorn flick to end the evening, you cannot go wrong with The Killer's Game. It is just a lot of fun, and I can't recommend it enough. So anyway, that's been my review of The Killer's Game. What you guys think of it? Say off in the comments down below. My name's Chris Tricon with 11 Hour Reviews, and that will be all for today.